Hello, everybody. Welcome to the module on memory and naming. So, for this module, you should have read Mojica's article about visiting ancestral earthwork or mound sites across the eastern third of North America, as well as Williams' op-ed um, about her. You want a Confederate monument? My body is a Confederate monument. And this photo right here is a photo of Monique Mojica on one of these mounds while she was on this mound crawl, giving you a little sense of that and what she's talking about. And the big question for this, right, for this unit is, can we start thinking about indigenous approaches to research as a way of addressing the silences in the historical record, the silences involved when you're working with documents that are primarily written by Europeans and not Native folks themselves. Now, of course, as Lisa Brooke reminds us at the beginning, right, that there are a lot of Native authors, right? There are many literate Native folks who are writing. However, many of them are writing in their native languages, which contemporary historians don't always know how to read. And just because even if they're writing in English, that doesn't necessarily mean that historians are interested in indigenous history. So how do we approach the past in different ways? Really thinking about this question for indigenous studies: how do we do research in ways that are informed by indigenous cultural perspectives and not just Eurocentric ones? Which involves the question of, where does history live? In the land and in our bodies, as well as books, classrooms, archives, etc. And this is going to involve approaching the subject matter in a different way than many students might be familiar with in high school. Because in high school, at least when I was a student, which admittedly was a long time ago and things could be very different, but when I was in high school, when we did history classes, the way we learned was we were taught that there was a set of facts, and it was our job to learn the facts. You know, we're going to learn the story, and it should be a factual story. Now, history in college is quite different, because it's not just what are the facts, it's also how do we know what we know? And how do we do history? How do we practice history? How do we create these accounts as a historian? Now, the reason for this is because universities are actually not capitalist institutions primarily. They are guilds. That's why we wear funny robes when we graduate. But the idea here, right, this is a guild of historians. So you don't, or in this class, as an ethnic studies class, a guild of ethnic studies professors. Although, you know, I have a background in archaeology and history as well. And so the idea, remember that Native American studies is interdisciplinary. Many people have that kind of cross-specialization. And so the idea right here essentially is, as a guild, like you're learning from the guild. How do we do this? How do we do the craft of history? And this is going to take us to some big organizing questions for this module. First of all, why are we defining the course as Indigenous History and Literature between 1700 and 1900? There's a lot of built-in cultural assumptions here that don't actually make sense in the context of Native people's experiences, Native people's worldviews, or the field of Native American and Indigenous studies. So first of all, let's just look at those kinds of boundaries of scopes, right? Why 1700s, right? First of all, the first thing that I noticed was that we're defining our scope of the class, what we're going to learn, really in ways that are around European history, and we're going to approach Native history through that Eurocentric lens. What happens in 1700s? Well, you have the American Revolution, the beginning of the United States as a nation state. You can also include the mission system in Spanish California in this time, which is important in California history. But ultimately, that's not about Native experiences, right? That's about the presence or absence of Europeans. Now, I'll come back to this in this module, right? But when we define indigenous history around the presence or absence of Europeans, or even the presence or absence of written records introduced by Europeans, we are creating a Eurocentric approach to indigenous history. We are literally centering Europeans in how we understand the past. Now, when we end the class at 1900, what we do is we separate this past from living people today. That is so counterintuitive to indigenous people's understandings of history and time. How could you possibly do this? In fact, I was talking about this with Stan Rushworth, the Cherokee guy, the Cherokee professor who had taught this class before me. And I said, Stan, I just don't know how to separate history in that kind of way. And he laughed and said, yeah, of course. And basically his answer is the same one that I'm doing in this class, which is we have institutional requirements by the state of California, which is, as a state government and as a settler colonial state government, is defining the parameters of how we study indigenous history. However, indigenous histories are defined by their own parameters, right? So you kind of like have to do this balancing work of meeting that that state level criteria, that bureaucratic criteria, while also doing justice to the subject matter itself. And this comes across so beautifully in Monique Mojica's work, because for her, you really can't separate the past and the present, right? It's all one thing. And, I really like her reading here because on the one hand, it's too early. It's about earthwork sites that were built before Europeans, but it's also too late. It's about her visiting these sites today. Like, it perfectly misses both sides of the class's chronology. And that problem makes her interesting in the context of what we're trying to do here. Because if you look at cutting-edge indigenous studies scholarship, you're going to see people, first of all, questioning what is the nature of time on a philosophical level, right? Because we need to approach our form of study through indigenous cultural perspectives and not only European ones. We can't just assume that European cultural perspectives are somehow better or somehow natural and normal. So first we have to interrogate what is the meaning of history as a philosophical question. The meaning of time as a philosophical question. Second, we have to interrogate the meaning of history. What is history? How do we know it, right? Most of the time history is defined through the study of written records. But once we do that, we're already silencing indigenous perspectives and indigenous voices. Because most of the time, again, those records are written by Europeans. Indigenous peoples had different ways of accounting for history and narrating history, including the oral tradition. I'm going to introduce a couple concepts in order to help just give us language for this kind of approach that we're doing that is grounded in indigenous studies and is in many ways antithetical to the official framing of this class as between 1700 to 1900. And the mound crawl, that refers to Mojica's work, and really getting at this question, where does history live, and what counts as real history? Now, the first piece I want to talk through is a concept, which is power and the production of history. And to do that, I'm going to draw on the work of Michel Rolph Trulot. Excuse my mispronunciation of the French. But anyway, Trulot is a Haitian scholar. He's not Native American, although he is Caribbean, and that's its own history of complicated interactions and relationships between indigenous and enslaved folks. However, his work provides a conceptual groundwork that is really helpful in this class, and that you're going to see the people we're writing citing, right? Indigenous studies folks love his work. So he's a Haitian anthropologist, and he's really looking at questions of how do we understand the past in the present through this language that he uses of silencing. Now, the first piece to understand is for Trullo, this word history, as a word in English, has two distinct meanings. Sometimes we mean that which happened, but sometimes history means that which is said to have happened. And those are two separate things. And we often conflate the two, but we really in this class need to separate. Is this that which happened, or is that which is said to have happened? For example, to kind of briefly go on Williams' article, right, when people were taking down Confederate statues across the South, a lot of conservative pundits said, hey, you're erasing history. This is bad. But this is precisely that distinction between the two senses of history for Trullo, right? Because what was being taken down wasn't necessarily what had happened. It was the story that was told about what was happening, or what had happened, through our public commemoration and statues. People had these ideas about what the Confederacy was and what history was like because they were taught that in high school and they were taught that through these sites, not because history necessarily happened that way. And in fact, most of these statues were not erected immediately after the Civil War. Most of them were erected in the rise of Jim Crow and segregation, and then later during the Civil Rights Movement. And in both cases, building statues was a way of asserting white supremacy, and often displacing black residents by building statues where their homes had been. So if you look at the history of not just the Civil War, but the commemoration of the Civil War, you actually see this whole other history, this history of how our stories about the past were constructed and shaped in a world where white supremacists who had control over the government at this point in time, right, were actively trying to entrench these power dynamics. However, generations later, we just come to accept those stories as if they were truth. And this is the next piece for Trullo. History consists of both mentions and silences, and that history is in fact a meshwork of mentions and silences. Mentions are straightforward, right? They are the things that are said in the records and the stories we tell. But the silences are a little harder to see. They're the pieces that are missing. In that example I just gave, that whole history of how these statues came to be erected and how that relates to Jim Crow policies or forced displacement of black communities, right? That is often silenced in those same accounts. So history is both mentions and silences. And for Trullo, we can actually try to understand the silences themselves because the silences tell us something important about power and the production of history, or the production of historical narratives. Now for Trullo, silences enter into history in 4 distinct moments. The first is the making of documents, right? You have authors, you have people in that historical moment in the past writing things down. The big silence that I've hit on over and over again, because it's so prominent, right, is that most of the documents we have available are written by Europeans and not Native folks. And even many of the documents that were written by Native peoples were written in indigenous languages, which is not precisely a silence in the making of documents, so I'll come back to it in a bit, right? But this raises the question, right, even in our data, even in the documents, the material through which we can come to know the past in the first place, whose perspectives are embodied in those documents and whose are missing? That's our first set of silences. The second set of silences will occur in the collection of documents, in collecting documents into an archive, right? So, for example, if you go to the Smithsonian Museum, I'm going to switch from archives to museum collections because my training is in archaeology. I'm a little more familiar with that, and it perfectly translates. But if you look at the Smithsonian Museum, right, they have every museum in the National Mall has its own warehouse in the suburbs of DC. And that suburb is going to be, those warehouses are each enormous buildings, right? Probably about half the size of Cabrillo or something along that line. And there are, at least 2 floors in each one. And it's just rooms and rooms and rooms filled with cabinets of objects that have been collected over time, right? But how do those objects make their way to the Smithsonian? Back when I was in grad school, I was researching Seminole Native Americans, so this would have been Florida era, although many Seminole folks were moved to Oklahoma in the Trail of Tears. But Seminole collections, and one thing that was really interesting was as I looked into how the Smithsonian obtained these documents, there were complicated histories behind that. So I was looking at a set of rattles, for example, that was collected in, I want to say, 1897 by a white scholar. I forget his name. A researcher. He's like a biologist or something like that. Not history, not indigenous peoples. But, he went on a, hunting trip or something where he hired some native tour guides to take him to this place in the Everglades. And while he was there, he visited a Seminole village and bought a rattle, a set of rattles from a household. Now, these rattles, they are strapped to your legs, and they're made from turtle shells. And the shells are filled with usually pebbles, or in the Everglades, because pebbles aren't commonly found, people would use seeds of certain plants. And the idea is that each time you stomp, that rattle attached to your leg will make a shaking sound. And so women wear these shakers on their legs during ceremony, and as they dance, their steps create the rhythm of the dance. So the women are the rhythm keepers. Now, this particular European historical figure believed that he was buying this object from the man who was his tour guide. However, he assumed that, right? Because that fit European ideas about gender, that the man would be the one in charge of all of this kind of stuff. However, when he asks this man about buying those rattles, the man talks to his wife, right? Because his wife is the one who owns them. Or at least the European scholar assumed that this woman was his wife, I should say. That could actually not be true. Again, these are all assumptions he made. So those are assumptions in the historical record. But those are silences within the making of the historical record, the documents themselves, in this case, the objects, his account of collecting these objects. But there's also power and silencing happening in how these objects become a part of the Smithsonian's collections, how they become collected into an archive. Because, right, there is a whole political and social structure that's happening here, right, where you have wealthy white folks going on leisure hunting trips, purchasing objects from Native American folks, assuming they're purchasing them from the man, but it's when actually these are the women's things. And then bringing that, and then he gives one of these 2 rattles, because there's one for each leg, he gives one of them to the Smithsonian. The other one, I don't know what happened to it. Right? So here's another moment, power in the collection of archives. What is the silence where one rattle was moved to the collection and one wasn't? What about all the other rattles that women made throughout time that aren't in the collections? That kind of stuff. Who is making the decision that says this is important enough for us to collect and preserve? in our museum or in our archive. So that's the second set of silences. Silences enter in the collection of documents into an archive or museum collection. Third, silences enter in the retrieval of archival documents. In that same Smithsonian institution, a lot of these objects, we don't even know what's in the Smithsonian institution, because a lot of the things that were collected in like the late 1800s, they didn't have necessarily great record keeping criteria. They didn't understand the importance of taking good records until later people realized, oh shit, we have no idea what the fuck these objects are about. We need to start taking better records. So a lot of objects in the Smithsonian are undocumented. And again, these buildings are so big, how are you going to find them? How do you know to locate that object? And they probably will never be located again unless somebody happens to just be browsing through the collections, comes across it, and thinks that it's interesting enough to look into it more deeply. So power and silences also enter into history in the moment when contemporary historians try to retrieve documents from the archive, or contemporary researchers try to retrieve objects from museum collections. Lastly, there is silences that enter in the creation of the narratives that we create from those documents, from those archives, from those collections. The silences in the stories that we tell. That, going back to the example of Confederate statues, right, that's that moment where people come to think that history is the statues themselves, not the historical processes of Jim Crow, where these statues were erected in the 1910s and 1920s, right? So there's silencing that happens in the making of that story. Now, for Trullo, sometimes these silences happen at the level of what he calls the unthinkable. The unthinkable refers to historical moments that are logically impossible within the cultural belief systems of people at the time. Or, historians in later years, right? And the idea is that that when something is unthinkable, that's a kind of silence, right? It's a silence because it was literally unthinkable that this could be happening, even though it was in fact happening. And Trullo's example for this is the Haitian Revolution. And he points out that if you look at if you look at French newspapers and people covering the Haitian Revolution at the time, it was unthinkable to French journalists and scholars at the time that black people in Haiti would be capable of organizing a revolution to liberate themselves. That was contrary to French people's assumptions about race and white supremacy. Because, right, and if you look at the documents, what you see is all of these narratives that try to find, like, the hidden player behind the scenes, right? There must be some white person orchestrating everything, right? Because how else could it happen? So that's a silence that happens in the making of historical documents. The documents that recorded the Haitian Revolution itself. And this is such a useful concept for this class, right? What in Native histories is unthinkable within settler colonial worldviews? And how does that contribute to the silencing of these indigenous histories? And with that, I'm going to start working through Mojica's work and talking to you. I'm going to teach you a little bit about both that work and her project, but also Native American deep history in the eastern third of the continent. And so Mojica in this project, she travels to ancestral sites across the eastern third of the United States, and you got to hear about many of those sites. These are earthworks, or mounds, they are often called. They are landscapes that were constructed by earthwork practices, by moving baskets of earth, basket at a time, to construct these built landscapes. And I have a couple examples for you in this image. The first one is a site, Cahokia. Cahokia is in contemporary, what is currently a suburb of St. Louis. It is the largest site north of Mexico. Most of it was built around 1050 AD. And in this picture, what you see is what's called the Grand Plaza. And in this plaza, right, first of all, the entire plaza is a leveled landscape. Indigenous architects leveled that entire space. And they built several mounds along the edges of this Grand Plaza, including the largest, which is called Monk's Mound. Monk's Mound is 10 stories tall. So this is an enormous building. And if you stand on top of it, you're higher than the trees, and you're overlooking St. Louis. And there's a stairway. It's a park now. You can go and visit. It's a really cool site. They have an interesting museum. And if you go to Monk's Mound, you can climb to the top, and people are walking their dog and doing yoga and meditating and having their new age spiritual moments and the things that people do in St. Louis. Now here's the wild thing. The Grand Plaza of Cahokia was only one of many Grand Plazas. We know of 100 different mounds in this site. However, there were many more that had existed, and we have records of them existing. People wrote about them. Europeans wrote about them. But they were destroyed by development in St. Louis. That's another, again, going back to Trullo, right? There's a silencing here. This is that development process by developing over indigenous landscapes and sites, right? We lost all of the data of those sites. What these sites looked like and what was buried in them, all that archaeology, right, is silenced as a function of, development, building things, contemporary economies. Not because anybody hated Native American peoples, but because they were trying to make a buck. That's power. This second site is the Great Serpent Mound. That's in Ohio, or what's currently Ohio. You can see this long undulating body of the snake that comes up and forms this head, and there's an oval bit right above the head that is often interpreted as either an egg or a sun. So again, these are two of the biggest sites in the continent. This is a really complicated history with a lot going on. We don't have secure dates for the Serpent Mound, I should say. It likely is probably 1,000 or 1,500 years or so before Cahokia, but we don't have great dates for it. So anyway, Monique Mojica travels to sites like Cahokia and the Great Serpent Mound, as well as many others. And she travels with 3 other colleagues. Chadwick Allen, who is an English professor in Lit Crit. He's a Chickasaw guy. Leanne Howe, who's Choctaw. She's a novelist, poet, and English professor. And Rick Knowles, who is a settler and professor of theater. And so Chadwick Allen writes a lot about his experience visiting these mounds too. He writes about them he talks about them as earth writing, a kind of script that is made through the earth itself, as a way of documenting indigenous histories, a form of indigenous documentation that is made not within the written scripts that we're familiar with, like English, but rather in the writing in the medium of the earth itself. It's a little metaphorical, from my perspective as an anthropologist, although he might have a different perspective. Leanne Howe, she both writes about her visits, and I'll tell you about one of her articles in the next slide, And she also is a novelist. She writes about some of these mounds in her book, Shell Shaker, which is a really beautiful work if you ever read it. It does such a great job talking about Choctaw history and identity and integrating the past and the present. Really thinking about, like, it jumps between these different time periods to show how these stories repeat through the different time periods and how the past impacts people's lives today. And you get to see all these kinds of nitty-gritty, messy silences that happen, both through colonial erasures, but also through the work of self-interested tribal officials who are, supposedly working on behalf of the people. And lastly, you have Rick Knowles, right? Rick Knowles, as I said, was a settler. His big argument from this trip is that what we're looking at with these earthwork mounds is the beginning of American theater. Or maybe not the beginning, but right, this is an early point in American theater. Because he points out that American theater is usually defined as U.S. theater, or maybe the theater of the European colonies. But that's a deeply Eurocentric perspective, right? Why, when we talk about the history of theater, why are we just flat out ignoring indigenous theater? And so many of these mound sites were platforms where ceremonial performances or theater happened, right? And I should say some of the mounds, right, have platform tops. Those were often the ones where ceremonies and theater was performed on top of them. Some of the platform mounds with the flat tops were community leaders would live on top of those mounds. And, for example, in Cahokia, you see that a lot, and there are arguments. Some people argue that Cahokia was a state society. Other people argue it wasn't. It's a big debate. But, Cahokia, there are several things about it that make it look like a state. And so, and then other mounds were used to bury the dead. Those tend to be more, have a conical shape. And then others were effigy mounds, like Serpent Mound. They take the shape of a geometric design or an animal or something else. And so Rick Knowles looks at these sites and says, this is the history of American theater right here. And we need to focus on that when we start our American theater classes. So really challenging these colonial assumptions in how we even come to define the history of theater in this example. Again, what are the silences in how we construct that narrative by looking at the historical documents? And so this site, this is Poverty Point. It's located in Louisiana, what's currently Louisiana. The bulk of this, if you look at the landscape, I have a photo for you. This is a LiDAR image. LiDAR is a technique that archaeologists use. It basically shoots lasers everywhere, and the lasers create a map of the landscape. The lasers pass through foliage, like trees and things, so you really just get the land underneath all that foliage and brush. So it's a really useful tool for archaeologists. And in this built landscape, there are 6 concentric ridges. They're kind of these semicircular shapes. So there's 6 of them. Those are 1 kilometer in Earth. That is a great expanse. That's a lot of dirt people are moving, right? This is a lot of work. There is a large mound, which is located on the west of those ridges. That's called Mound A. Archaeologists have uncreative naming practices, Mound A, because it's the biggest mound. I forget exactly how big it is, but I think it's like 6 or 8 football fields. So again, we're talking about a lot of dirt. And archaeological studies actually found that Mound A was built in about, 60 days or so. Not very long. It was built very quickly. However, it was built by foraging peoples, by hunter-gatherers, right? No agriculture. And it was built by people with no fixed social hierarchy. There would have been people who adopted leadership roles in orchestrating the mound, or orchestrating the construction of the mound, but they were essentially project managers. They didn't hold any power beyond just coordinating people to do this project. And then there's a couple mounds to the north and south of that big mound, smaller mounds. And there's a couple mounds closer to that river, the bayou. Now, if you look at this site, most of it was built in the late Archaic period, around 35,000 years before today. So that would have been the ridges and most of those mounds. There are older mounds. I'll come back to that in the next slide. Watson Break was 2,000 years earlier, about 550 or so. 5,500 years before present. And, you can see here how archaeologists define this time period, right? We like giving things names like this. And all of these, you can see Cahokia here, right, around 1050. And so, the first thing I want y'all to notice looking at this picture is look at how small the colonial moment is within the scope of these histories that we're talking about. We often get so caught up in this idea that the colonial moment is like the apex of human history, that like this is like some statement about the nature of humanity. But this is a tiny blip within indigenous histories. Sure, it's an extremely violent blip. It has really, it deeply impacts people's lives today because it is the world we live in today. But there's a lot more going on in indigenous history. So again, go back to that question. Why do we start indigenous history in 1700? Not even 1492 or even 1491, which would still be problematic. Why do we set the parameters of the course this way? And remember, right, we're setting those parameters of what we're going to learn before we do any learning, right? Before we understand the subject matter. That's another moment where you see silences entering into the narrative. Because whose assumptions dictate that scope of what we're even going to learn. Hey, you guys, I made a mistake in that last bit. The archaeological study on Mound A, they ran a few different models, estimating the site being built in 30, 60, 90 days. I think what they landed on in terms of like comparing to other evidence and what they thought was most reasonable was 90 days, not 60. I'm sorry for that. That's going to matter when I come back to Leanne Howe in the next slide. There's a philosopher, a Potawatomi Native American philosopher named Kyle White, and he has this lovely article where he kind of talks about this idea of, he's talking with a friend of his and he talks about how the colonial moment is just this kind of like fleeting moment, right? However violent, however pervasive it is today, it's this fleeting moment. As an archaeologist, one thing I always try to keep in mind is that in 1,000 years, the United States is not going to exist and the world is going to be really different. And who knows what it's going to look like in 1,000 years. Now, coming back to Poverty Point, right? I told you about that landscape right there, but when people built this place, they made direct north-south alignments to older sites that were built in the Watson Break period, which had been built 2,000 years before the rest of Poverty Point. So if you look at this map, you see Poverty Point again, right? And on that these north-south lines where some of the mounds align with a Watson Break mound. Watson Break is an archaeological culture. It's just a category. Basically, it means people who had similar material culture practices because that's what we see archaeologically. So people who had similar points that they used, and in later periods, similar pottery. Not necessarily that they saw themselves as belonging to a shared identity or anything like that, but their material culture is similar. So anyway, we have this north-south alignment. 2.4 kilometers to the south, we have a Watson Break mound. 1.7 kilometers to the north, we have another Watson Break mound. And these are directly aligned with the mounds at Poverty Point. This is a tremendous engineering feat, right? This is some planned design that is happening. Now, archaeologists debate what this site was used for. Some suggest it was a residential site inhabited by a multi-ethnic community. Others suggest it was a abandoned ceremonial and trading area where people didn't live there full time, but they would come to visit for ceremony and for trade. Ultimately, we don't have great data because even though there's a lot of people doing research on the site, this landscape has been plowed by Euro-American agriculture farmers for hundreds of years. So the archaeological record is pretty messed up at this point. So it's a little hard to really nail this stuff down, particularly in this site here. Now, when Leanne Howe goes on this mound crawl, she writes an article focusing on Poverty Point. And she talks about this idea of returning to ancestral place. And returning to place is also a way of returning to ancestral knowledge. And so she talks about, and if you look at this, I have another chronology for you. Here we have indigenous history going back to the Middle Archaic period. And on the far right, I have the different phases of the landscape here in this place in central Louisiana. You have that big chunk in the middle. That's when the bulk of Poverty Point was made, right? The ridges, Mound A, and many of the other mounds. 2,000 years before that, you have Lower Jackson and Motley Mound. Those are those Watson Brake archaeological culture mounds, built 2,000 years before. And then there's another mound in Poverty Point that belongs to the Coles Creek archaeological culture. That dates to the same time as Cahokia, around 1050 or 1000 before AD. And so what Leanne Howe points to, is that what we are seeing here is a landscape, a place where indigenous peoples returned to their ancestors who had been separated by them by 2,000 years. And they did it not once, not twice, but they're still doing it today, right? So when people built the bulk, like the ridges in Mound A, they were returning to their ancestors, returning to landscapes shaped by their ancestors 2,000 years before. And when people come back again in Coles Creek, they're returning again to a landscape after another 2,000 years. And here is Leanne Howe and Monique Mojica visiting these places again. And so for Mojica, these landscapes like Poverty Point, they're tied to indigenous people's knowledge, including oral histories and oral traditions, as well as environmental knowledge. She has a whole interpretation of this site as being a particular kind of relationship to hawks in particular. She points out that there's a lot of pieces there, but for example, she points out the time of building Mound A is similar to the gestation period of a hawk from inception to hatching. I can't remember exactly. But anyway, right, that it embodies this kind of indigenous knowledge about environmental processes. Now, Mojica, for her part, works with Leanne Howe to create this performance, this piece of performance art called Sideshow Freaks and Circus Engines. And if you look at these pictures, right, the first one, you see that's Mojica in the center, that's Leanne Howe to the right, and to the left is the director. I forget his name, but he's another indigenous guy. And in the bottom, you have Mojica in the performance itself. She's an actor in the performance. And if you can kind of make out this image that's projected on that curtain in the back, that's actually a design from something that was excavated archaeologically from one of these mounds. It's a bird. It looks particularly like a crested woodpecker, and it has these little circles coming out of its mouth, which, many people interpret it as a representation of an indigenous oral tradition that was recorded in the 18 and 1900s about an entity called Bead Spitter, a person named Bead Spitter. And so Lian Hao is really drawing these sources from these mounts into her performance art. And she talks about this as her creative process, as her research process, where she lies on the mounds, she walks through the mounds, and by being in that space, by being on the land, she is taking on those residual forces of all those generations of indigenous dance and indigenous ceremony that were danced on this land. And she's taking that spiritual power into her body so that she can extend it forth and give it to her own, extend it forth into her own theater. So this is for her a way of making theater that is in continuity. Right? It's a way of, to use Lian Hao's word, it's a way of returning to ancestral performances. And so it's a performance that is in continuity with the much deeper past. And she talks about this as a kind of indigenous research methodology, drawing on this work by Sean Wilson called Research is Ceremony, which really argues for how do we do research in ways that are informed by indigenous cultural frameworks and not only Eurocentric frameworks, and certainly isn't going to take those Eurocentric cultural frameworks for granted as neutral statements of truth, as opposed to complicated cultural assumptions. And she writes in this work that by doing this kind of practice of having her body in the landscape, it regenerates her creative source by placing me in the life-giving land as an embodied research process that requires me to walk on, touch, feel, smell, and absorb the stories, forms, and structures of effigy mounds and earthworks to connect to the ancestors who built them and the people who still inhabit this region. Right? And this is getting at the heart of some of these assumptions in Eurocentric research traditions that Mojica is critiquing, right? Because it's not, if you think about the way you learn to do research in high school, for example, you were probably taught that you need to be objective. And the way to be objective is to remove your own perspective from the document or from your work. However, that's not human. It's not even possible, right? Because your perspective is always going to inform your work. And ultimately, this idea of objectivity, right? It's almost like the goal is to be a disembodied I that hovers over the world and views the world without interacting with it. That metaphor is not mine. That comes from a German philosopher from several centuries ago. But it really illustrates the underlying cultural assumptions. And ultimately, as human beings, we are not disembodied I's. I have never managed to accomplish that in my life. Not for lack of trying. And indigenous research is more likely going to start from different sets of assumption. Because in indigenous cultural frameworks, knowledge comes out of relationships. And you can't separate the knowledge from the relationship. And that's a relationship that you have to have, it's embodied, right? We have our bodies, you as a body are interacting with other people. And it happens in place. You can only ever learn in a particular place, right? Because we are human beings, we have a body, and our body exists in space. And so for indigenous research methods, that's the starting point. It's relationships. It's land. And if you think back to the way that some of the scholars you've even read so far, such as Sayers Roods, talk about land in indigenous intellectual histories, in indigenous philosophies, it's not just the soil, it's not just the dirt. It's the relationships. It's all the human and non-human beings and all of their relationships, right? Because we grow plants, we grow crops from the soil, and we eat that, and then we poop and we die and we decompose, right? And so the idea is the land is not just the physical matrix of soil, it's also all those relationships. It's almost, sometimes I think of it like a kind of composite body, right? Where the land is your body, it's my body, it's all the animals, it's the plants, all kind of put together. And this leads to the second concept for today's lecture, and we're approaching the end. I promise, I know it's a lot. This is an idea, the idea is the concept of living versus dead heritage. Living objects versus dead objects, living sites versus dead sites. Now, within the literature, right, the idea is that most of what we come to think of as objective historical sources are going to be alienated objects or dead objects. By alienated, I mean that they are severed from living communities. That shell rattle that turtle shell rattle I told you about earlier, that sits in the Smithsonian Museum and is not used by living peoples for their dance. That's a dead object. It's severed from community life. It's alienated from the community. Whereas heritage or living objects, living heritage, these objects are given what one scholar, Kirschenblatt Gimblett, who is not an indigenous person but useful here, calls a second life. So a good example of that is going to be when so the idea basically, and then I'll give you the example. The idea basically is that you have the first life, which is in which the object is used, or the site is used by people for some usually pragmatic purpose. And then the second life happens when people aren't really using the object in that way anymore, but it's still meaningful to them because it's their heritage. It's something that has to do with their ancestors. So these things have obtain what Kirschenblatt Gimblett calls a second life, because they are again important to community life, to living communities, just in a new way. So an example of this, when I was in my research, I did something very similar to Mojica. I traveled to different mound sites across the southeast with members of a indigenous community, folks who were not who claimed descendancy from the Muskogee Confederacy, which is indigenous to Georgia, Alabama, northern Florida area. And one time I was visiting one of these sites with this guy, one of the folks I was working with, Robert, an elder, and Robert told me a story about how he would travel to this one site in Alabama called Holuby. And this site was a Muskogee Confederacy village, a town, a community, a people, up until removal, up until the Trail of Tears in the 1820s. The Creek Trail of Tears happens a little before the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which is the federal level law where they start removing Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw folks. Creek removal actually happens a little before that. So anyway, 1800s, right? People are removed, and they remove to Oklahoma. And the people who had been Holuby Town in Alabama, or what became Alabama after that point, now they still form their own community, and they just call it Holuby. So there's a Holuby in Oklahoma today. And it is a spiritual community. It's a place where people go to dance and do ceremony. And so one time Robert was visiting the old Holuby town in Alabama. And he picks up this quartz projectile point that he finds on the earth. I say projectile point because they're often called arrowheads, in colloquial speech, but most of them are actually spear points. So in archaeology, I'll use the term projectile point because it's more precise. So anyway, he finds a quartz projectile point. And the thing about this projectile point is quartz is not a great material for making stone tools. The crystal structure of the stone is not regular enough compared to chert or flint, which is more glassy in its texture. Chert is a little rough, it's a little jagged, so it's not great to make stone tools from. So when the person who made and used this object originally, that Creek person who made and used this object, they may have made it out of quartz because it was pretty. It could have symbolic or spiritual meaning. Or it could just be that they didn't have any better quality stone lying around. And so they made it out of what they had on hand, and it did the job until they didn't need it. And I will say that particular point did look like it was used, which would imply that it wasn't purely for spiritual purposes or symbolic purposes. So that's that first life. That's the first life of the point, right? It is either a utilitarian object as a kind of like, shit, this is the material I have on hand, it'll have to do for now, or it's a spiritual object. However, once Robert picks it up, that object now starts living its second life as heritage, as a living object. And so Robert takes that over to his friends in Hulubi in Oklahoma, because he likes to go visit Hulubi and he dances with them. He had been doing so for a long time. And he goes to his friend, an old man, and he says, hey, I want to give this to you. And he gives this old man the projectile point. And that man starts crying. And he says, wow, this is something I'm going to give to my daughter so that she can give it to my grandson once he's old enough to understand. So that's that second life, right? The projectile point is meaningful because it embodies a connection to the ancestors. And it's a part of active community life. That's really different from the objects sitting around in the Smithsonian. So living objects are actively involved in community life, whereas dead objects tend to be preserved. They tend to undergo passive preservation processes by specialists, right? The experts need to know, hey, what's the right atmospheric conditions to keep these scraps of paper from deteriorating? Things like that. Living objects and living heritage includes intangible heritage, meaning stories, dances, knowledge, practices, beliefs, whereas dead objects are only the tangible objects, just the object itself, the point. Now, one thing that's really interesting, and I'll just point to this briefly, is if you look at the Smithsonian Institution's, one of their museums, the National Museum of the the National Museum of the American Indian, or NMAI, they do a lot of really interesting work balancing how to do museum preservation as specialists while also treating these objects as part of living communities and that allow people to come use and interact with these objects. And in fact, the people who work there will tell you that many of these objects are themselves alive or considered to be alive by indigenous peoples. And so here's coming back to Monique Mojica, right? When she talks about the sites being living, she means in this sense, right? In the sense of these mounds now have a second life as heritage, but she also means literally. She is telling you this site is alive. It is the composite being of all of the relations of all of the beings that live in this place and walk on this place. And so there's kind of two levels there. Now, once we make this kind of claim, right, that these sites, that mound sites are living a second life by virtue of indigenous peoples returning to them, by them being an active member in indigenous community life today, or an active part, right? Part of the implication of that is that these histories are not over. So when Monique Mojica takes those ceremonies into her body, takes that dance into her body, and extends it forth into her own performance, she is making a future for these histories. So not only is the settler colonialism just a fleeting blip within these larger indigenous histories, but those deep indigenous histories of mounds also are not yet finished. And it is jumping the gun to say that these sites are prehistorical and dead, because they really are not. And if you look at them from indigenous perspectives, this is an ongoing history. It never stopped. And this brings me to what I find to be the most important piece of Mojica's thinking in this article. And I will tell you that I have cited Mojica in almost everything I have published on this subject, which is most of the big journals in anthropology. And this is why. She walks in these mounds and she says, how do I talk about realisms when definitions of realism and what is perceived and presumed to be real depend on my continued erasure, my vanishing outline against the preservation of archaeological remains, collection of data, confirmation of evidence, of language and signage that declares our cultures abandoned as they fell into decline. Now remember, Monique Mojica is a performance artist. She's a theater person. So she's interested in realism as a genre, right? A genre that within theater. But she's applying that concept to archaeology and history, right? What are the genre conventions? What are the realisms of archaeological writing and historical writing? What are the tropes that scholars use to create that genre? Because that's a cultural process. Even though realism is supposed to be a representation, even though realism is supposed to be a window into the thing that is real, it's supposed to be a transparent window. She's telling us we need to think about this as a literary genre. We need to think about archaeological and historical writing as literary genres. And what is realism when the very definitions of what is counted as real depend on Mojica's erasure, her continued erasure as an indigenous person? Because if you go to these sites, you'll see all of these narratives, these stories told through interpretive signs on the landscape that talk about the preservation of archaeological remains by specialists, the collection of data, and confirmation of evidence, while ultimately narrating this history that frames indigenous mounds as prehistorical sites, as places that are abandoned sites or that fell into decline, as if these histories were over. And Monique Mojica is saying, hey, I'm still here. I am still here. My body is in these landscapes. I'm still dancing these ceremonies, just in a different way. Because, the dance keeps changing. This is actually something I learned from the folks I work with, the community I worked with. They say with all of their most important ceremonial dances, the idea is that it's all one dance, and you just take breaks of several months in between rounds. But it's the same dance that people were dancing hundreds and even thousands of years ago. And, as time progresses, as time goes on, people die and they leave the dance, or their spirits continue to dance, but in invisible forms. And new people are born and they join in the dance. But it's all one dance. It's all ongoing. So how do I talk about realisms when definitions of realism and what is perceived and continued to be real depend on Mojica's continued erasure as an indigenous person? Depend on the anachronistic and anachronistic assumption, the false assumption, to put it another way, that that these deep indigenous histories are over and finished. Because they sure are not. And that is another set of larger silences that we have to grapple with in a class on indigenous histories and literatures. Because what counts as history? What counts as literature, right? These are ideas based in European and Eurocentric cultural traditions. that are not necessarily going to fit the subject matter. And it's going to be organized according to cultural assumptions that make sense in a settler society, but not once you start acknowledging the simple, mere fact that indigenous peoples still exist today. So going back to that quote, right? How does Native American studies challenge everything that the U.S. has to offer in terms of education and society? Well, hopefully at this point you've seen a few examples of how.